Hello everyone and welcome back to the Great Book of Grudges. My name is Nathan and today we're going to do something a little bit different. As you can tell, we're going to be looking at Man O' War Corsair and we're going to be asking the big question, was it any good? So Man O' War Corsair is a naval battles game. If you're into, say for example, Mount and Blade, then this might seem kind of familiar, but rather than being on land and forming an empire, you are a naval leader, you are a pirate, you are a chaos lord on the sea. This was a game that was released years ago, back when Games Workshop would give the license to pretty much everyone that had at least a $5 on them, and stayed on perpetual early access. It has since then been removed from the Steam Workshop, but you can still buy it through Good Old Games for like £24, which that's up to you to decide if it's worth it or not. Keep in mind this game is receiving no more updates, and this wasn't because Games Workshop did remove their license. Yes, this was a thing, but it's not been getting updates for a long time, and it will never get updates ever again, I'm imagining. But why do I want to talk about this game today? You see, it's one of those games that could have potentially been great. And I don't mean just like good for a Warhammer game, I mean like really could have been great. It had a lot of potential, and you could tell that the developer had quite a lot planned. There was a weird thing where the developer started working on a different project and that was getting more attention, which is a massive shame. But let's actually jump into the game itself. You see, you'd have to make your character at the beginning. I've turned off all my saves and so on, so there is a tutorial to play. And yeah, you could either play as an independent, which means that you were completely neutral, this is the true sandbox experience, or you could decide to either go directly to make an Imperial or a Bretonnian, or a Chaos Lord, which you could pick if you wanted it to be a Lord of Khorne, Tzeentch, Slaanesh, or Nurgle, and those would have their own dedicated ships, by the way. There were loads of ships implemented into the game. Character creator itself was pretty basic, more like the first Mount and Blade, perhaps even less so. But the character creator wasn't really the big thing here, as you'd mostly be controlling your ship, and even then, when you actually did control your character, there wasn't really much of a point at looking at your character. You were too busy focusing on everything else that was being thrown at you, whether this was enemy ships, attacking a settlement, or even dealing with a giant monster.
It's no good! We ain't gonna make it! Those damn greenskins are gonna cut us off!
Graphically, the game wasn't actually too bad, as you can tell. Obviously, this was something from 2016 and it was developed prior to that. But yeah, I mean, pretty open world. We'll talk about the map a little bit later. You're thrown into fighting straight into the tutorial, and I think that's a great thing. The tutorial itself is, around 15-20 minutes long, depending on how you play, and the idea was just to teach you all the mechanics to then throw you directly into the actual fray. And combat was pretty cool. You know, you'd want to check out your enemy, you'd want to be able to move around, navigate, know how to fire, all the usual type of stuff. Every now and then the game did stutter, but it was very minor, and it did stable out after a while. You could see that here on screen. There was a minor stutter for like a split second, but combat itself was focused in multiple ways. The most common was actually just using your ship. You could fire with cannons, obviously depending on where your cannons were located, because if your cannon was located on the side of the ship, you had to make sure that the ship was facing that side so you could actually use it. But then afterwards you could get into combat proper, which was literally just throwing you straight into the fray. This was the basic melee combat. I think the tutorial was actually not too bad. Combat is super jank, by the way. Well, I wouldn't call it jank, I'd call it 2016 type of gameplay. Even then, maybe even early 2000s type of gameplay. But yeah, you'd get in, you'd do some damage, you'd fight with either a weapon that you had. Sometimes you'd have a ranged weapon, sometimes you'd have a melee weapon. You could change that around, by the way, with eventual purchasing of gear. Here we'd be fighting some greenskins, which you sadly can't play as. You can in custom battles, but it's a massive shame that development never got to the point of adding in more races and factions. Off from the bat, you can see that the mouse is super hectic, getting vision and so on. This is just how the mouse itself worked, which was a bit of a shame. You could fiddle around with that in the settings though, but I'm showing you the pure vanilla experience. Obviously, depending what weapon you had is depending how you would fight. I had a sword and musket at the very beginning, so I wasn't really being able to do too much. You'd have to help out your crew, by the way, because you don't want your crew being killed off, or else you'd suffer in the long run, as yes, your crewmates can die, you need to replace them, or else your ship would not work in its most optimal state. And yeah, I mean, from a very basic point of view, just 5 minutes or so into the game, it's actually not too bad. And it's one of those things where you thought, wow, this has actually got a lot to show for, and it does get better. There are a lot of things to do in this game with no real set campaign. This is more of a pure sandbox thing, again, very similar to like the Mount and Blade series, but it's a shame that it just died out. There was potential here with this game, that's for sure. There's a lot of different enemy variety. Obviously, right now we're just fighting greenskins and so on, but you will end up seeing Cornates, you will end up seeing Skaven, hell, a lot of siege monsters too. And surprisingly, a lot of different character models for a game like this. I wasn't actually expecting it this way, because with these types of games, they're generally just like one and done. So this is why I thought it was very, very impressive, because the fact is there were loads of different animations, there were loads of different character models and so on, which wasn't really tend to be seen in these types of games, right? The very basic early access games. When you get into towns and so on, you actually have a little bit of freedom to explore. Here's where you'll be seeing your character mostly. And yeah, you can actually do quests. You can increase your fame with certain factions. You can start recruiting some new crew, as crew is obviously very important. It's actually not too bad. I would say that the areas are quite small, like you're going into areas like, say, for example, Marienburg or Erengrad, massive port cities in the Warhammer Fantasy franchise, and they are very, very quick to explore. The smallest maps I've seen so far, but hey, you know, these types of games were meant to be focused on sea battle more than anything else, so I wouldn't say that's a bad thing anyway. You can explore here. Obviously, this is still part of the tutorial, but when you finish the tutorial, that's where the fun begins. Either you make a new character, or you continue with the one that you've already got, you're independent, and you can now truly enjoy the sandbox experience, which means going to do missions, doing quests, escorting ships, attacking enemies. Maybe you want to decide to be a pirate and you can actually freely attack all the other nations. So say, for example, even if you start as a Bretonnian, yeah, you can start firing at other Bretonnian ships. It allows you to be an outlaw. It allows you to form your own narrative. And it's kind of cool because here, when you're in a city, you're able to upgrade your ship. You're able to, say, for example, buy better equipment or change your ship. Maybe you want to buy a second ship and hire a captain so you can start your own fleet. Obviously, these types of things are very expensive, so you wouldn't be able to do that early on. But the idea was there is a lot of stuff for you to play with. And honestly, when this game got announced, I was super excited. I was like, wow, this is going to be something really different for a Warhammer game, you know? RPG sandbox type of thing. Many people thought this was going to be like the Warhammer Fantasy version of Skyrim, which obviously was not a good thing to think, because at that point in time, the majority of the Warhammer games that we'd been receiving were absolute garbage. Yes, there were some diamonds in the rough, but still, when it comes to Warhammer games, the first thing you have to do is set yourself an expectation and then lower it by about 5 steps. If it's better, great. If it's not, well, you weren't really surprised now, were you? But ultimately, the game wasn't bad, and it was receiving fairly decent updates in terms of speed. Unfortunately, it just got slower and slower and slower, which is a massive shame, as there were some pretty good systems, and combat was actually not too bad. There were also some big surprises, like, say, for example, as you're just going around, going to different locations, trying to do some quests, and a giant freaking shark or a sea dragon, depending on where you were, sometimes the monsters would vary, would start attacking you, and you'd be forced to fight one of these giant creatures. These were creatures from the original Man O' War tabletop game, so a lot of people did feel quite a lot of nostalgia for it. Yeah, early on these monsters are quite easy, depending on the ones. The sea dragon itself wasn't really much of a problem, the Megalodon was, however, and yeah, it's one of these things where it would kind of jump scare you a little bit because you'd never really expect them unless you were paying attention, which in most cases I wouldn't. But yeah, I mean, how cool was this type of stuff? The models of the monsters were fairly decent for the monsters at the time. The only problem is the monsters were quite predictable, so you knew when they were going to be coming for you. You could keep an eye out for them. But ultimately, yeah, I mean, it was something that was kind of fun, a little annoying in certain locations where you honestly didn't want to deal with this. And the great thing is that you could kill these monsters if you wanted to actively hunt for them, and you could pick up some loot to be able to sell. Which, by the way, the grand majority of the ships that you'll be fighting will have some sort of loot. Either it's something that you want to pick up for yourself, like Megalodon Teeth, or something like a pendant which you'd be able to sell off and gain some favor with your chosen faction. Combat itself could feel fairly repetitive, but really, it was one of those things that it depended on your ship, it depended if you changed your gear enough, and it wouldn't feel too bad. The great thing about combat is that it worked as intended, which is something that's quite surprising, despite the fact of all the different weapons that we have. As you can see here, at this point, there is a orc ship coming for me. It's going to do a lot of damage as it hits me, because keep in mind, if you see in the bottom left hand part of the screen, you'll see my ship, right? If it takes too much damage, it'll get red. If, say for example, the cannons get fully red, that means that the cannons will not work. I'll need to repair them. So this is a great way for you to be able to take out enemy stuff. You could take out their sails, you could take out anything really, as long as you were pretty good at aiming at them, which could become a bit of an issue depending on obviously how you fought and so on. But yeah, I liked this system. I thought this was a very good system to implement, as you could effectively totally stop some enemy ships and then go around them to a point that they can't hit you and then just take them out. Obviously, they're going to have their own things to be able to hit you back, and your ship can get destroyed, and if you die or your ship gets totally destroyed, that's game over. You'll have to either revert to an older save if you were saving, or you'll have to start a new character. You'll want to save often, considering that the world map is absolutely massive and there's a lot to see. From the Sea of Claws in Kislev, all the way to, say for example, the Empire in Bretonia. Then you can keep going down and travel to Estalia and to the Talian Sea, all the way to the borders of the Border Princes. It's a huge map, and it does take a lot of time to traverse. So there you can start building up your relations with loads of other factions, or you can start fighting, or maybe you'll get ambushed. There are loads of big creatures there. There are loads of enemy warbands, orc warbands, chaos warbands. There's a lot to go from there. The great thing is, once you have the ship, you can actually auto-travel to different locations, and if any combat does start, you'll get like a notification. The game will get slower, for example. It's one of these things which was done fairly well. The game is always active, by the way. This is a very important thing to note. So when you're traveling, other things are traveling. If you're fighting, other things are fighting around you, and sometimes even trying to hit your ship whilst you're boarding another enemy ship, which I think is pretty interesting. And you're going to see the enemies very fairly on. I mean, even just here, I'm going to be fighting a Cornate warband straight from the very beginning, which is literally from the beginning of a fresh new campaign. And you're going to be able to see, say, for example, Beastmen. You're going to be able to see Chaos Spawn. You're going to be able to see Chaos Warriors. Sometimes they might have some normal mortals, but obviously that makes sense because some pirates can be hired by the Chaos Warbands. I could talk about the sound design, but what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to let it play for about 20 to 30 seconds so you can actually hear what the game sounds like during combat. Itself wasn't bad, the sound of the game wasn't bad, you can hear the firing, you can hear this, that, and the other. The only problem is that it was pretty repetitive. It's one of these things where that basic sound battle music will be playing constantly. This is unfortunately something that never got changed in the future, but then again, you know, the game is dead. It is completely dead. You can still buy it and play it, but don't expect anything new. There was actually a fair amount of management in this game, which was fairly charming. You see, not only would you have to focus on yourself, but you'd have to sort out your crew. They can level up. They can also get new equipment. You could change around their equipment. You'd have to actually pay them. You need water and provisions to feed them, because if not, they'll actually die. And you could focus up on your character getting new skills and so on. Boosting up your crew would be able to get you new modifiers for your ship, getting some abilities for yourself also by leveling up, so getting some toughness, better melee combat, better leadership. The idea was there was a lot. You could even focus on getting your favor up with different factions. By fighting enemies of certain other factions, you could get discounts from them. You could get more money from them. It was not bad. It was actually quite surprisingly thorough. Which is why I every now and then do come back to this game, because I do get the itch, and then I feel bad that this game is just never going to get updated again. And if you don't want to play as, say, a pirate or a trader or something, and you want to play as a chaos warrior, you can. You get different types of ships too. So here, for example, we're starting off with a Tzeentchian warband. The problem is that visibility is pretty awful, mostly because the ship is massive. You will see some other types of Tzeentchian ships too, because you start off with a warband. The Tzeentchian ones are known to fly, which is quite important. If you were used to play Man of War, the actual tabletop game, you'll remember all these types of things. You'll start off with a pretty strong warband because, yeah, you need to get favor to be able to recruit. You won't be able to go into towns to recruit. This is very, very different. I will warn you, however, that Tzeentchian ships are fairly awful, so this is starting off with a fresh campaign. It's never wise to go directly to attack a settlement, as the settlements will have towers and they will fire directly at you. You'll see that the AI will also send some defensive forces against you, so as you check on the minimap there are some ships attacking my ships, which are not performing too well. I would say, in all honesty, that the Tzeentchian ships are probably the worst in early game. They do get much better later on, so you do have to take your time, but it's kind of fun to see it this way, mostly just because I'm fighting and everyone else is fighting too. If I were to get boarded, the fighting still continues from any other point. People will still be firing at me, people will still be firing at my ships, and my ships will still be doing some damage. So this wasn't like, say, for example, Bannerlords, where you get in combat and it would be an isolated thing. The world is radiant here, and it's kind of cool to see it that way, because that means that you're seeing everything in real time. Whilst you're fighting here, there are potentially other ships on the other side of the world getting into their own skirmishes, their own combat, and it's great to see it that way. Also, yes, there are a lot of player models. So, for example, here we're seeing enemies in the styling of, I believe, the Alcantony Fellowship. Yes, I was correct. So there are a lot of different factions that you would see. It's the same thing as, like, say, for example, the Chaos Warrior factions would be different. Obviously, with the Tzeentchian one, I have access to some pink horrors, but say with someone else, I'd have another type of troop. There were Marauders for Slaanesh, for example, even Exalted Marauders of Slaanesh, which were pretty cool. The Chaos Spawn would very much be the same, but then again, yeah, you know, it's just color tinting, very much like the tabletop. Now, you could go on custom battles and you could tailor it to how you wanted. The big thing is there were a lot of different playable factions that you just sadly can't play in campaigns, such as, you know, the Undead, the Skaven, and so on. You can see them around, though, which is obviously kind of cool, but it's a shame that you couldn't play as a pure Undead faction or pure Skaven faction yourself. But yeah, it shows you what was capable in this game when you can have 4 separate teams, each with quite fairly large fleets, fighting each other. It's a massive shame that this didn't get improved further and didn't get the quality of life updates and even just general updates that it did deserve. From some reports that I was seeing online, the dev basically started working on another title and just started ignoring this one. I'm not sure how valid that is or not, but it's a massive shame considering that this was potentially going to be a good Warhammer game. And one thing that was really impressive is all the factions worked differently. So here I'm playing as a Skaven. This is a custom battle, and I'm playing as a ship that has a Screaming Bell. So my only attack is really just a Screaming Bell. You can see obviously some Dark Elf ships being pulled by sea dragons. It's so hectic. There's even warp fire throwers on enemy ships, which, by the way, will damage you. Friendly fire is a thing, and you can get set on fire by your own allies. There is just literally so much here. You can see my Gracier is just casting every now and then, but there's not really too much to the Skaven. Hell, even the Skaven themselves are incredibly janky, so getting into proper combat, they can't move properly, they can't really attack properly. It was a faction that got implemented for custom battles but never got ironed out properly, which is a massive shame. There was so much that could have been done here. A lot of people would have instantly bought this game if you could have just played a Skaven on campaign, that's certainly for sure. But these are the things that happen with this game. So, is this game good? Yes and no. If you want to play as a just sandbox campaign very early to the original Mount and Blade style, yeah, that's pretty much what you're going to get. It's janky, but it wasn't really a bad title. It's definitely one of those titles which if they would have had attention, if the devs would have worked a little bit more on it, this would have been remembered as one of the best Warhammer games. I'm not even kidding, it is actually fairly good and ranks fairly high on my list of opinion. And I play a lot of Warhammer video games, especially anything that's related to Warhammer Fantasy. Should you pick up this title? Well, I wouldn't say so, at least not with the price that it currently has. £24 is not going to be worth it. If it ever goes on massive sale on Good Old Games, then sure, try it out. It's actually not too bad. But I wouldn't really buy it for this price. I wouldn't really buy it for anything higher than, say, a tenner. You could get a decent amount of hours on it, I must say, but as you can see on screen, there is jank when you're playing as certain things. I wouldn't say that this is worth the price that is being listed online, that's for sure. If you can find it online cheaper, go for it. But I think the best way to actually showcase this game is to literally give you a full custom battle. This is a free-for-all with 4 factions, with the best equipment that they can get, and yeah, you can see how it works, and obviously there are a few things that are unbalanced, let's keep that in mind. But let me know what you guys think in the comments below, start a bit of a discussion. Is this a game that you'd be willing to pick up yourself? Is this a game that you wish was still getting updated? Yeah, let me know, and until then, I'll see you all again very, very soon. Have a good day.